name is Jocelyn Munguia. I'm the program coordinator of the space. The LCC is a place and space of conscience or conciencia. And we remember the past, reflect on the present, and imagine a future. And together we can envision common solutions for challenges throughout our communities. And there is a painting outside in the lobby with a heart, and it represents a Spanish saying, con el corazón en la mano. And with that very spirit of solidarity and learning, we welcome everyone to listen and share similar and different perspectives and experiences, as long as this is done in a respectful and civil manner. If someone chooses to disregard this house rule, we reserve the right to ask anyone to leave. And so with that, we thank you for joining us for this Zona Abierta Open Zone program, Keeping Families Together. Today's program is part of a continuing programming effort to welcome community leaders like Oscar Chacon. He is the co-founder and executive director of Alianza Americas, which is an umbrella-led and immigrant-serving organizations based in the U.S., and is dedicated to improving the lives of Latinx communities here in the U.S. as well as people throughout the Americas. And he will discuss what is happening in U.S. immigration policy. So before we begin with the program, we would like to thank our student co-sponsors, Feminist United and Fearless Undocumented Alliance. I would also like to take the opportunity on behalf of the LCC director, Rosa Cabrera, and myself to thank our wonderful staff, student educators, graduate assistant, and interns, because without your knowledge and support, this wouldn't be possible, and we wouldn't be who we are today. So with that, let's welcome Oscar Chacon. Thank
you. Should I proceed in English or should we do Spanish? How do you want to do it? English? That's fine. I was told that sometimes most people speak Spanish and kind of prefer Spanish, but I'm fine with English too. Well, my name is Oscar, as it was already mentioned. I was born and raised in El Salvador, which is one of the countries from where so many young people, unaccompanied children with their families have been coming from. Not just the last 6 months, but frankly, the last 35 years. People kind of think that this issue began just a little while ago, but in reality, it began, as I said, a good number of years ago. Most of you weren't even born, when these issues began to take root. There are two questions or topics, that are listed in the presentation. I'm going to try to briefly address both of them, and then we can actually engage in a conversation. Otherwise, you're gonna fall asleep on me. So, first of all, let me say that the reason why so many Central Americans began to come to the US in the late 1970s and early 80s was the direct result of US foreign policy in those countries. Back then, the US was firmly aligned, and frankly, it remains aligned, with people who are basically super rich, in these countries, and who had sham democracies, because they did elect presidents, but they chose who the president was going to be, even though people went, to elections. And when people got tired of voting every 4 or 5 years and still getting the same people in office, they began to figure out that elections didn't really work, and that the only way to get rid of a military dictatorship was to actually exercise one of the rights that every people in a democracy should have, which is to depose the people in power and replace them with people who represent the interest of the majority. That's one way in which democracy should work. But the problem is people in power didn't want to do that. And so they asked the US for more help, by basically getting the US to provide them weapons, to provide them training, guidance, etc., etc. And as a result, a very violent situation ensued, a situation that became full-blown civil wars. And I know that when in the US, one says a civil war, people have read, a little bit about the US Civil War. If you happen to have been born abroad, maybe you experience a little bit of that. But otherwise, it's something that most people don't understand in as far as what it means. Wars are incredibly painful. They absolutely tend to make the majority of poor people pay the highest price, whenever there is a conflict like this. And so what happened is that as the conflict got so intense, a lot of people who were not necessarily ready to join the armed revolution, in Guatemala, El Salvador, even in Nicaragua, they, as a matter of common sense, decided to begin to flee, their countries, to basically be safe. And they did not just leave alone, meaning individuals alone, but sometimes entire family groups left. And so you may not be familiar at all, with a young woman, Jennifer Flores. Actually, she was a teenager back in the 80s, and she was separated, from her parents and kept in detention for months and months. She, alongside several other young people, filed a class action lawsuit in 1985. And that class action lawsuit is something that now has been a little bit in the news because people refer to the Flores Agreement. And the Flores Settlement Agreement is basically the evolution of that fight, that began in 85. People who were running away from dictatorial regimes, running away from literally death squads, in countries in Central America. When they arrived here, they learned that contrary to what some lawyers thought, that they were going to be protected, upon their arrival in the US, the reality is they were not. And their political asylum claims were systematically denied. Even though, if you do a Google search, Central American countries 1980s, all the stories that you will come across are horrifying. And when I say horrifying, I mean literally. You would wake up in the morning, try to go to work or to school, and you would literally walk over dead bodies. That's how bad the situation was. Because anybody who the government considered opposition, they felt free to basically eliminate them. They even killed an archbishop, in El Salvador in 1980. They killed 4 U.S. church women, including a couple of nuns. They killed 9 priests in 1989, in El Salvador. They killed entire villages in Guatemala, just to give you an idea what kind of reality people were fleeing from. And as I said, families were being kept in detention forever and ever. And this particular case I go back to, the Jennifer Flores case, set a precedent that basically remains important today. Because the only reason why the US cannot, under this agreement, detain kids, for more than 20 days, and if they must keep them, they have to keep them in a separate type of facility, not a jail, is because of that particular settlement agreement. But again, I want to go back to the fact that the US play a central role, in basically detonating what has been a steady flow of people ever since. I also want to point out that in the late 80s, as communities were settling, especially in Los Angeles, California, a lot of parents who had brought their kids very young had to work, each one of them, 2 and sometimes 3 jobs to be able to make ends meet, and provide for them and their families, but also to send money back home. Because they kept sending money, to help, children who may have been left behind. Sometimes the spouse, stay behind. Sometimes the mother stay behind. So people send money back home. But there was a social price, to pay, a social cost. Kids were growing up alone. And as they began to go to school, they got exposed, to the world of youth gangs. in Los Angeles. Some of them, very few really, became violent, and as they became violent, they actually end up in jail, released. But then California passed a law called 3 strikes and out. As a result of that law, which combined, with a worsening in immigration policies, which I will address quickly or briefly, I should say, in a moment, these kids, even though they did not know El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, they began to be deported, to these countries. And as they were deported, to these countries, they soon realized that in a country where there was hardly any order, any authority, they were still in the middle of wars, this was kind of a good place, to mount a violent operation in the form of youth gangs in these countries. Which, of course, I'm not at all saying that all kids who originally got attracted, to youth gangs were necessarily violent criminals. Because ironically, a lot of kids in the country of origin were also growing up without their mom or their dad or both. And so all of it configures in a way in which youth gangs appear in the landscape of Central American countries. So as the wars came to an end, El Salvador in 1992, Guatemala in 1996, we did not necessarily arrive to peaceful and prosperous societies. The poverty was still there. The poverty that had caused a revolution to begin with remained in place. But there was a big difference. Millions and millions of dollars were coming, into Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, sent by the people who did leave and managed to get a job, in the U.S. Now, let me quickly close this chapter because I already spoke for, let me make sure I don't talk too long, 10 minutes. So let me quickly bring into the conversation U.S. immigration policy. Again, most of you are too young to remember, but back in even the early 1980s, for the most part in the US, we did not differentiate or ask people about their immigration status. Just to share with you an anecdote, in 1982, 83 actually, I was stopped by the police in New York City. Pretty much in a case of racial profiling. I was driving, going to the bank, to do a deposit for the place I was working at the time, a law firm. And I had, back then, we didn't use electronic deposits and all that. And so I was carrying a bag full of cash, to deposit in the bank. A police cruiser stopped next to me, saw the bag with the money, and immediately stopped. I didn't have a driver license. I didn't even know what a registration was or what an insurance card, was. Because my boss asked me if I knew how to drive and if I could go to the bank, and I said yes. He never asked me if I had a license. So I went to the bank. But the bottom line is, police stopped me and gave me 3 tickets. They fined me for driving without a license. They fined me for driving without proof of insurance and without proof of registration. And told me, you have to go right away to get your driver license. They never asked about my immigration status. And I didn't have any. I wasn't documented, at the time. But that's just to exemplify that even as of 1983 in New York City, forget about other parts of the country, but it was even more relaxed. In other parts of the country, an undocumented alien could show up to the Social Security Administration, apply for a Social Security card, and get one. That's how easy it was, okay? Clearly, the world has changed from then to now. Because from then to now, most people arriving to this country are people who look like this room. Meaning non-white, non-Protestants, and not necessarily English speakers when we first come to the country. So in 1970, 61% of the people living in this country born abroad were European. In 2010, the picture looked like us, like this room, very different, maybe with the exception of this lady here. Where are you from?
I'm from here.
Okay, so I was right. So I want to highlight how race plays into how immigration policy has changed. The more minority based immigration has become, the more restrictive we became. Okay? And to make a long story short, from that episode that I told you about in my own case in 1983 until today, even in Chicago, a so-called immigrant-friendly city, if they stop you and you don't have a driver license, they will immediately ask you, especially if you don't know how to speak English, where is your green card or proof of, citizenship? So, and you could easily end up, in the hands of the immigration police, known as ICE. And the moment in history when all these bad laws became embedded in our system is 1996. That's the year when the worst US immigration policy in nearly 60 years was passed. I won't detail what that law is all about. Suffice to say that it is as draconian that it is retroactively applicable. What does retroactively mean? It means that if you committed a violation according to this 1996 law, it doesn't matter when you committed the violation. Normally when a government approves a law, that law is applicable from that moment forward. It's not applicable before. But this law, 1996, is actually called Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. That's the name of it. It's horrible. If you ever wonder where did the idea come to have local police forces become immigration officers, 1996. If you ever wonder where did the separation of families that forces people to have to wait outside the US either 3 or 10 years before they can obtain a visa to come into the US, 1996. If you ever wonder when did it become so expensive to apply for citizenship, 1996. So almost every bad thing about immigrants that we've seen in recent times is actually embedded in the 1996 immigration policy. And from that point forward, it's only gotten worse. But let me give you one concrete example. Trump has not needed to pass one single new law to do what he's doing, because everything he needs is readily available. Because Jeff Sessions, do you all know who Jeff Sessions is? The Attorney General. He's one of the people who wrote the 1996 immigration law. That's how bad it is. So Obama was, frankly, not much better when it comes to immigrants. Even though people love to say Obama was great in the Obama years, I wish we were back there. In some ways, I agree it's true. But on immigrants, not necessarily. He deported more people than any president before him. And Trump is not even coming close yet in terms of numbers of people deported. But one thing I will tell you, behind what's been happening, even the change in the law, there is a narrative that paints people like you and I as a threat to the country. An economic threat, a political threat, a social threat, a cultural threat. Because we don't look like most Americans like to think we look like. And in fairness, still to this day, 62% of the population of the country is white. If you only focus on borders, 69% of the voting population in this country is white. So, because we have been successfully painted as a threat to the country, and you may be wondering, what does a narrative have to do? Look, if you successfully demonize a given social subject, you can do whatever you want to that social subject and nobody will complain. Because in the mind of most people, it is already acceptable that you will treat a given threat with force, with severity. And that's what the narrative does. You know, people get to be conditioned in their mind to be okay, you know, with abuses being committed against a social subject. If you ever wonder why does police kill black people left and right and hardly anybody end up in jail, that's because as a society we have successfully demonized black people as criminals, as rapists, as whatever else you want. Same things that are said about Latinos today, especially immigrants. So this administration, and with this I will end, this administration came to the White House with absolute clarity about two goals they wanted to accomplish when it comes to immigration and immigrants. One is, let's curtail, let's limit the number of foreign nationals coming into this country every way we can. Because in their mind, we have been taking way too many foreigners over the last 40 years. And so goal number one is reduce the number of people coming in at whatever the cost. So if you ever wonder why children are being separated from their parents, it is because it's a political tool. It's a political weapon, you know, to tell potential people wanting to come, don't dare to come, because if you do, we're going to take away your kids and God knows if you will see them again. Still happening today. You know, that they do this exactly with the deliberate purpose of making people fearful, okay? But the second goal is, let's eject from the country everyone who is undesirable, or to use our president's words, anybody who has come from a shithole country should not be here. And they will use everything that the law permits them to do to achieve that goal. They are willing to go as far as questioning whether somebody like me, who is a naturalized US citizen, obtain that naturalization certificate in a lawful way. That's how far they're willing to go. You may have heard recently about public charge as an argument to basically deny entry to people in the US, but also to go after legal permanent residents, who in the view of the government have already become a public charge, and therefore they shouldn't be here. So those are the two central goals of this administration. There is a lot more I'd like to say, but I already talked too much. So I'd like to ask if you have comments, questions, because I understand that this is not supposed to be a Q&A per se, but rather a conversation. So you may have stories that you want to share, and that would be great. You know, and I'll be listening and learning attentively. So, where is Jocelyn? Oh, okay. I don't know if you want to say anything else or.
Yeah, feel free to take this time to, like Oscar mentioned, give your feedback about what he just shared. If you have any questions about any of the policies that he shared, or any of the updates that you might be wondering about within immigration context, this is the time for you to do so. And you know, feel free to not take it only as a lecture, but rather as a community dialogue. So this is your time.
She's raising her hand.
So I was wondering if you can share with us a little bit more of what Alianza Americas is doing to address a lot of the concerns that, you know, that are happening within our community.
Sure. Why don't we do something? Why don't we like go around and, you know, have you say whatever you want to say or ask whatever you want to ask, maybe 3 or 4 of you at a time, and then I can respond if need be. I'll be happy to come back to the question of what do we do, because I do want people to know. There is one good thing I want to make sure that everybody knows here anyways. So anybody else has comments, questions? You are the most shy group of people I've seen in a while. Come on. There you go.
So I had a question about how myths are spread through entertainment, because I remember reading, because of the military industrial complex, the way sometimes the military, like, I think it was in Iron Man, the way they portray Iron Man, and especially during the Vietnam War, the military, sometimes they fund these movies or something, but they put caption in that you have to demonize the other, like, you have to portray them as people who torture their enemies. That way it's easier for us. So is there a solution to we can also be against the military and everything, but is it like the job of a citizen to boycott these movies, just so that, Hollywood gets a message clear that if you demonize someone else, no matter how entertaining it may be, then no one's gonna watch it, kind of. So is there a supply and demand factor in this that people have to be aware about so as to prevent these things from taking place?
Yeah, excellent question. Comment. Anybody else?
I have
Yes.
a question. So, you kind of opened with talking about the role that U.S. foreign policy plays, and I was wondering, why are we hearing about the role that this has in immigration, and are there strategies for exposing this kind of, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Yes.
Who was president in 1996? I was born after that.
Good to know. Yeah, well done.
It wasn't Clinton?
Was it Clinton?
It was Clinton?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. Anybody else? Comment, question? Yes.
Does Mexico play a role in that they're the border that many Central Americans have to cross?
Sure. Anybody else?
Yeah, could you provide an update on the status of the separation of the current issues, the separation of parents and children?
Yeah. Anybody else?
I didn't have a question, but I had a comment.
Right.
I thought it was really interesting how you brought up the point that separating families is a political tool because many people like to dismiss Trump as perhaps incompetent, and so they might say the families are being separated because they're incompetent, but I never really thought about how it could be used as a political tool to prevent more immigrants from wanting to come. So I thought that was really interesting. And also, it kind of just makes me, I guess, take the administration more seriously, not only because it's not just Trump, it's really a bunch of people that make up this administration. And I'm sure there are some pretty intelligent people, even if I don't agree with what they're doing.
Yes. Any other comment, question? No. Well, I'll try to answer some of the questions. I don't know that I will be able to answer them all. And interrupt me if need be. And I will do a little bit of moderation to remind you that we have to wrap it up in 20 minutes, right? Okay. Let me begin by the first question that was asked and invite you on the 18th of this month. There is a similar event, probably a little more formal, but I just recommended that they do it from a methodology point of view, much more participatory, but an event that will be taking place at Loyola. You can check our website, alianzaamericas.org, to learn more about that event. It will be on the same topic, family separation, although the way we are branding it is Forums for Family Unity. And we had the first one of them in Washington, D.C. yesterday. New York will be second on the 16th, then Chicago on the 18th, and then Miami, and then San Francisco. And we may actually do one in El Paso, Texas, as well. What we do in Alianza Americas, first of all, let me just explain quickly. We are a network of organizations. So Alianza Americas as such does not provide services directly to communities because that's not what a network normally does. We serve one purpose, and it is to be an advocacy platform for our membership. And that platform is made by our members. We articulate the policy platform by our members, but we serve essentially as an advocacy tool. And the advocacy role we play is not just in relationship to the US government, but it is also in relationship to the governments of countries of origin, primarily Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and international bodies such as the United Nations. That's the other place where we bring, our advocacy proposals, our voices, because those are the places where decisions are made about migrants, about people, without people being taken into account. So that's essentially what we do. I can explain if need be later more in detail what that means, but that's kind of what we do. Let me try to tie in at least a couple of the comments, questions. One about the role of mass media, because that's the way I interpret, your comment. Not just Iron Man the movie, but the role of mass media altogether. And the question of why aren't we talking about foreign policy, First of all, let me say that the way we all think is not so organic, natural, and independent. The way we all think is shaped. And it is shaped by what we are listening, what we are viewing, and what we are reading. All of that has a role in how we think. You all may think that you are very independently minded, but be skeptical. Because the reality is the way we all think, it's not so random or accidental. There is a concept that is hardly ever spoken about in the US. Ideology. Ideology is, in sum, the collection of ideas that make us think the way we do. But it is not something we arrive to accidentally. It's driven, by interest, by economic interest. You mentioned the industrial military complex, that's one of them. But there are several other powerful interests. Let me give you one example of an idea that most people accept without questioning. And hopefully not all of you, but most people in society. We accept, without even realizing, that a white person will always be more competent than a colored person. Be that Hispanic, Black, Southeast Asian, whatever you want, okay? We don't even realize how we accept that, but that's how ideology shapes, the way we think. We all have been taught in a very clever manner to think that private enterprise has the solution for all of humanity's problems. That's why healthcare is better, in the hands of private providers. That's why education is best, when provided by private institutions, because we've been trained to think that way. We've also been trained to think that taxes are bad. And one who pays taxes is a fool, and one who can fool the government is somebody to celebrate, like Donald Trump. All these clever ideas are embedded in our minds since we are little kids. Foreign policy, ironically, we are indeed in many ways the epicenter of global power, at least one of them, globally speaking. But most Americans are very ignorant about foreign affairs. That's why in foreign affairs, you'll be surprised to see that the difference between having a Democrat and having a Republican is hardly felt abroad, because people perceive us the same. Why? Because nobody's monitoring. Nobody's even thinking about foreign affairs, because we are trained not to think about it. Alianza Americas, I'm the executive director, obviously I'm biased, but I love to think that we are very unique in the sense that we do believe that especially Latinos should be far more engaged in foreign affairs. Because that's one of the key reasons why our people end up wanting to come here. And we have spread a lot of these ideas that we accept as truth in the US to many countries around the world. What is Mexico's role today? Somebody asked. Well, sadly, Mexico has become largely a partner of the US in many of the things that are happening. Do you know, for example, that as deportations decrease in numbers at the US southern border, beginning in 2014, apprehensions and deportations from Mexico went through the roof. So Mexico has become, for all practical purposes, the new external frontier, the new external border for the US. And they just agreed recently to begin to accept people that the US government will deport, even though they may not be Mexicans. That's never happened before. And not only the outgoing government, but in the incoming government in Mexico, López Obrador administration seems likely to go along, with that policy. Just so that you understand, in this case, the role of Mexico. And most definitely, everything I described to you about the dominant narrative and the fact that this horrible policy was adopted in 1996 should already have given you some clues that when it comes to these issues, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is minimum. Clinton was president in 1996, but how many of you know Luis Gutierrez, the congressman? Some of you do? He voted for that law in 1996. And many Democrats voted for the law that I described very briefly to you in 1996. So again, we are a long way, from really changing these things, but it will take people able to think critically, wanting to be different, to actually change from where we are today to where we need to be. And I can tell you that this is going to be a slow process. We have elections on November the 6th. A lot of my colleagues, especially in Washington, are very focused on trying to get as many people to come out and vote on November the 6th, and I believe it is important to go vote. But I always tell people, if you are wondering why in the primaries there were more Republicans voting than Democrats, I don't know if you knew that, but sadly that's what's been happening. There are more Republicans excited to go vote than there are Democrats. And part of the explanation is because a lot of young people in particular are not really listening anything new, coming out from the Democratic Party. And they feel that it doesn't make a difference if I go vote or don't go vote. But one thing I will tell you, even if the Democrats were to take over the House of Representatives and hopefully the Senate, I am not hopeful that will mean tomorrow that we will have better immigration policies. Because so far the Democratic Party, and I'm talking about the top echelons of the Democratic Party, has not yet put forward a proposal that makes me tell you that they are absolutely willing to challenge in a very significant manner the policies that have been in place for so long. Now, what are we to do? We are to be much more demanding, from the leaders of the Democratic Party for change. And sometimes it will probably take joining other political parties, for change. Because I believe that the moment we are in requires of a lot of innovation and creativity if we are to really come out of the mess we are in. Now, somebody asked about where are we with detentions right now? The Guardian just published yesterday, an article focused on what's going on in Texas, in a town called Tornillo. I don't know how many of you have heard of Tornillo in Texas. Tornillo had a shelter for kids, for immigrant kids, that was supposed to house 400 kids maximum. Okay? They already expanded Tornillo to handle 2,400. And they are preparing to double if need be. According to this article yesterday in The Guardian, and I mentioned The Guardian among other articles simply because I find The Guardian to be a bit of a breath of fresh air in terms of investigative journalism. They claim that there are 12,400 kids as of now still separated, from their parents. And there are also a couple of hundred kids still part of the group that back in July, the federal court said that had to be reunited, with their parents. Now, why are they still not together? Well, the reason is because our government sent the parents back to Guatemala, Honduras, and only a handful of cases to El Salvador, I have to say. The majority of them are from Honduras and Guatemala. And they deported those people on their wrong promises, false promises. They told the parents, if you sign this paper saying that you're willing to be deported right away, your kid will go with you. And of course the parents signed. Only to find out, once they were in handcuffs and in, how do you call grilletes? I forget. Shackles. That the kid wasn't there, in the plane. I met one such a father in Honduras about a month ago. It was heartbreaking to hear this poor guy crying like a baby because his 5-year-old son is in a shelter, God knows where in New York, without knowing at all when he will be reunited, with his kid. So we still have a long way to go. The government is actively working to basically trash the Flores agreement that I mentioned earlier, because they consider the Flores agreement obsolete. And they are trying to say that the only way they can neutralize, people from coming is if they can be even tougher than they have been so far. So in this respect, yes, it is a political weapon, a political tool that they are using, to basically make people fearful that if they dare to come, their kids will be taken away. It is not a random, accidental, the act of a full man. No, it's very carefully planned, and it is being very carefully executed. I would say, or add to your comment, that anybody who thinks that the people in government now are a bunch of fools, make a fool of themselves. They are anything but fools. If we are not careful, we will end up with the crazy we saw last Thursday in TV in the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh. But there are 24 more just like him that are part of the list of people that was handed to Donald Trump. And he could pick any one of those 25 names because they are equally bad. But maybe not all of them are sexual predators, like Kavanaugh. Because as far as I can tell, he's bad news, from many angles. So again, that definitely keep in mind, they're not fools. Now, let me see, why didn't I address? Well, the last thing I think I did not address is, I'm happy to see that so many of you took time to be here this afternoon, but we need to take this conversation to many more places. And if you can think of a place anywhere that we can bring these conversations into, that would make a heck of a difference. Because the only way we will change where we are today is if we get more people to understand what's going on, if we can challenge more people about their beliefs. That's the only way we will come out. I see you raising your hand, so. We have 5 more minutes.
Do you believe or do you think that we will need international intervention eventually?
In the US?
Yes.
We already have plenty of international intervention.
But
You know,
an extreme level.
no, frankly, I don't think we are heading that way. But you know, you allow me to make a point that it's been in the mind of a lot of people without exactly knowing how to think of it or how to say it. We fear parents and children, you know, arriving to our border as if they are really a threat. And I'm not talking about you in this room, I'm talking about society as a whole. But the reality is, the things we should really be guarding ourselves from, nobody seems to be too concerned about. For example, there are far more drugs coming into the US today than there were 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago. But in case you don't know, we spend a ton of money supposedly interdicting drugs from coming into the country. Let me be blunt, because a lot of white people have been dying because of the so-called opioid epidemic. It's in the news a lot more lately. But the reality is, how can you possibly make sense of so much more drugs coming into the country when we are spending so much more money than ever before? So the things that really matter, that makes a difference. Let me give you another example. If most of you had to take off your body, everything you're wearing that was not manufactured in the US, we would all be naked in this room. So, and this did not begin last year. It did not begin with Barack Obama. This began literally 45, 50 years ago, when we told companies, go produce abroad and bring back the products because you will make 10 times more profits. So we are being invaded, but not in the way you were suggesting, but we need to think about these issues. You know, a friend of mine just told me, can we invite the UN to come and monitor us? I wish we could do that. I just don't think it's necessarily realistic that it will happen.
Is there anything that could shock the entire nation that doesn't hurt anyone, that galvanizes people? So
Well, let me end with this, because we have 2 more minutes. You may be thinking that I am a irreparable pessimistic,
no.
okay? On the contrary, I am extremely optimistic. I've been living almost 40 years in the US. And to this day, I still say it, as I was saying it almost 40 years ago, that most Americans are actually good people. Everyone, okay? The problem is we are, to put it nicely, very naive, you know, as a society. So the challenge is taking this message to all the places that matter and challenge people not so much in the brain. Because, you know, we tend to throw numbers and statistics. It doesn't work. If your heart is closed, your brain is even more so. So we have to touch people at the emotional level first if we are to succeed getting them to use their brains right.
So empathy would be the key.
And that's largely, you know, I don't have more time to explain detail, but that's largely what we are trying to do at Alianza Americas. Create as many opportunities for meaningful social interaction. That's the only way we will neutralize the lies from the truth, you know, because frankly, and this is my last thing to say, if we were crafting immigration policy based solely on the facts, this issue would not be an issue. Because based on the evidence, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, people without papers, they all are a true blessing for our country. And a blessing for their own countries too. So we have to really aspire to arrive to a day when our policies reflect that, as opposed to the lies that, you know, are really behind the policies that we now have in place. Thank you very much for having come.